Yeah, I should probably introduce myself. My name's Chris. You might be able to tell from my accent that I'm not from around here. I'm from the UK. Any Brits in? Well, one, couple. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I've been working with Microsoft BI for longer than I care to mention. I might look. I know I look only about 21, but you know, it's been. Probably started first working with the beta version of OLAP services and SQL Server 7 back in 98, 99. For most of my career, I've been best known for doing analysis services and MDX stuff. That's what I've spent most of my career doing. There's obviously a natural progression from analysis services onto Power Pivot, onto analysis services tabular, and then onto the data model in Power BI. And along the way, I came across what was then called Data Explorer as a kind of experimental feature, which then became Power Query, which then became Get and Transform in Excel 2016 and the query editor in Power BI, which is the subject of today's talk, and also the subject of tomorrow's talk when we get a little bit more geeky and talk about working with web services. So in terms of my career, I started off being very much a kind of corporate BI person. But analysis services has always got that self-service flavor. The interesting thing is Microsoft SQL Server BI was always thought of as being, you know, corporate and very IT controlled. But you know, even when self-service BI became a thing, a lot of the customers that I was working with were saying, oh, we've got to have self-service BI. And actually what they really wanted was self-service report creation, which is what analysis services has been giving you for the last 20-odd years. So it's not really a new thing, and maybe not quite such a big progression to move like I did from corporate BI to something a little bit more self-servicey. And I think anyway, one of the strengths of Power BI is that it straddles those two worlds. It's not corporate, but it's not, you know, kind of pure self-service chaos on the desktop as well. You know, one of the real strengths of the Microsoft BI story is that kind of seamless grow up from, you know, desktop-based stuff starting either in Excel or in Power BI and moving up to something a bit more corporate. I mean, as far as my career goes, I did a couple of Permi jobs. I mean, I was very lucky to have a job that allowed me to learn a lot about analysis services very early on. And I was always fairly involved with the community, but you know, back when I started, the community was absolutely nothing like it is today. You know, there was maybe 1-2 conferences a year in the whole world, and the one that I went to, the past European conference, was lucky to get about 200 people for the whole of Europe. And I've been to SQL Server user groups in small towns in Europe with better attendance than that now. And I was always quite into answering questions on forums. And when blogs became a thing, then I suddenly thought, well, instead of having to write the same answer over and over again on a forum, I'll get a blog. And then I started writing things up from there. And I suppose you know, some people, blogging is a bit like dieting. A lot of people start it, but the ones that really stick at it are probably the ones that have got that kind of obsessive gene in them anyway. I wish I could diet the way that I blog. But no, I suppose it's just something that I kind of always enjoyed, and got into the habit of writing down just about every interesting new thing that I learn. And the main reason I do it is that there is probably a lot of benefit in writing something down and explaining it, because you don't really understand something until you've had to think about writing it down for explanation to other people. And certainly, most of the stuff that I write down, I immediately forget, and I spend half of my time reading things that I've written just to remind myself of what it is that I learned 2 years ago that's actually still relevant. And you know, certainly, maybe not for this presentation, but for the presentation tomorrow on web services, I've been looking over old blog posts, thinking, oh, wow, I forgot I wrote that. That's interesting. There are 1 or 2 posts I completely forgot I'd written and actually learned some really interesting stuff from my previous self. So it's kind of good personal discipline. And, you know, the things that I find useful and interesting, the things that I use in my everyday work doing, well, nowadays, a lot of Power BI development, I guess these are the things that other people find interesting. Personally, I don't like to think about writing a blog as something like writing a book or writing a training course. It's literally just a small gobbet of information that I've learned that week that, you know, hopefully I can share and find interesting. And the one thing I still don't understand is the things that other people, you know, some blog posts get lots of hits, some blog posts get none, and I have absolutely no idea why some things get more interest than others. So the star rating thing that was in the keynote, that was literally me one week thinking, oh, you know, I need to get a blog post out this week. What can I write about? And I couldn't think of anything useful that I'd learned. And then somebody sent me an email literally while I was thinking about this saying, oh, Chris, can you put a line break in a text box? And I thought, oh, well, can't you put a line break in a text box? And it turned out you couldn't. And you still can't, actually. But then I was thinking about, well, surely you've got to be able to put a line break in with to insert a Unicode character. And then it turned out there was a DAX function for this. And it was like, oh, it wasn't documented anywhere. So I thought, oh, I'll do a blog post on that. And then I thought, well, what can you do with Unicode characters? And I'd seen a presentation by Will Thompson, who's one of the program managers, who'd been using Unicode characters. And then I thought, oh, you build a measure with that. You can do, you know, kind of dynamically generate a string. So that became a blog post, which was a stopgap written on a Saturday afternoon where I hadn't got anything else to do. And suddenly that becomes way more popular than all those blog posts that I spend hours slaving over. And there we go. Right, I think after that bit of waffle, we are almost ready to begin. I'll let everybody get started. Okay, thank you for coming. Like I said, this is a mildly geeky subject, but something that I find really useful and interesting, and hopefully I'll be able to communicate my enthusiasm for parameters and functions to you. As I also said, this is a 200/300 level session. We are not going to be going into the depths of the M language. If you want to get geeky with M, join me tomorrow for working with web services. There will be lots of code in that. In fact, part of the cool stuff about the cool thing about some of the stuff I'm going to be showing you in this session is that there is going to be no code needed. But you'll be able to do some really useful stuff, some things you might not realize you were able to do without writing any code. And specifically what we're going to cover is what are parameters. There'll be some demos of the things that you can do with them, showing how you can configure parameters inside the query editor. Then we'll look specifically at using parameters to build template files, which are a vastly underestimated feature in my opinion. And then finally, when we hit kind of peak geek, we will talk about using parameters to generate functions, parameterized queries, which is a lot less scary than it sounds. So, parameters. Parameters live in the query editor. And parameters are actually very, very easy things to understand. We know that in the query editor, we're connecting to data sources normally and getting data. And each job of work that we do inside the query editor is called a query. And normally a query connects to the data source and brings back a table of data, and that table is what gets loaded into the Power BI data model or the Excel data model if we're in Excel. All a parameter is a special type of query, but it's one that doesn't connect anywhere outside. It's just a simple query where you can enter a value. And the other interesting thing about a parameter is that it is returning not a table, but a single value. A single primitive value, a bit of text, a date, a number. Now, where can we create parameters? Let's start up Power BI Desktop. It's important to stress that everything that I show you here demoed in Power BI Desktop is something that you can do in Excel as well. So here, if we go to Power BI Desktop, Edit Queries, you will see there is a big button here to say Manage Parameters. That's the button we're going to be pressing. In Excel 2016, if I go to open the query editor, you will see, again, there is a big button for Manage Parameters. So the things that I'm going to show you here in Power BI Desktop, they're all things that you can do in Excel as well. So we're going to close Excel for a moment and carry on doing all of our demos in Power BI Desktop. So like I said, a parameter is a very, very simple thing. It's a query that returns a single value. And if I want to create a new parameter, I can click the button, click the new parameter option here, and we get the new parameter dialog. And let's create a parameter, let's call it message. We'll make it text. We'll leave that as is. And let's just enter the value hello world. So now I've got a parameter, which is kind of like a variable or a kind of hard-coded value, and it's going to return hello world. And once I've created a parameter, I've selected that parameter query here, I'm able to change the value of the parameter without having to go back to that new parameter dialog. Now, some of you who've done a bit more M might be thinking, well, why do I need a parameter for this? You know, what's special about a parameter? I can already create queries that return single values like this. So, for example, I could create a new query. Let's go to create a new blank query here. Go to the advanced editor. Delete all of this. So there's a query that returns a bit of text, which is hello world. Click done. You can see that it returns the text. What's the difference? Well, if we look at the code for this, it really does just return that bit of text, hello world. A parameter is not only the value you enter. If we have a quick peek behind the scenes in the advanced editor, it's the value you entered plus some special metadata that means that the Power BI, the query editor user interface, knows that this is a parameter and it knows to do special things in the user interface for this parameter. I can actually convert a parameter back to a normal query by right-clicking on it. When I do that, all that's done is just removed that extra bit of metadata. So there isn't really all that much. I can even convert it to a parameter again if I want. There isn't really all that much difference. You know, parameters aren't anything special. They are just queries that return single values. Bits of text, numbers, dates. We can't actually return tables or lists from a parameter. It would be quite handy if we could. We can't do that. So what are the uses for a parameter? Like I said, I use parameters all the time when I'm developing in Power BI. And the thing that I use parameters most for is literally just as kind of global variables. When you're loading data in the query editor, quite often there are things that you might want to be able to change easily, and you don't want to have to go digging around inside a query to be able to change them. So things like data sources. You know, if I'm loading data from a file, the file path, the file name might change. I might be loading multiple tables of data from the same Excel file. I don't want to, every time the Excel file changes its location, I don't want to have to go through 10 different queries changing the location. I can store that file path and that file name in a parameter. When the file changes, I can just change the parameter. Everything gets updated. Similarly, if I'm filtering some data, you know, I might be filtering by a particular value. That same value I might be filtering by in lots and lots of different queries. I don't want to have to go rooting around in the query editor to be able to find that particular hard-coded value and change it across all of my queries. I want to be able to define it in one place, reference it across all of my queries, and be able to update it very easily. And there are tons of other uses. You know, for example, I might be changing data sources when I go from dev to test to production. You know, I might have some special hard-coded value that I want to use inside calculations. So let's see a slightly more complicated demo of when parameters are useful. Let's delete this stuff. And what have I got here? I've got an Excel file with a table in it. This is a table that's sourced from a table in Wikipedia. It's not very exciting data. It is a list of all of the counties in all of the states for the USA. So, I've made an effort. I've tried to localize my demo for all of you Americans. But it's nice and easy to understand. So, let's load this into Power BI. And let's get this list of counties. And you can see here that I've got a list of counties, and I've got the county name, I've got the state name, and I've got the 2-letter abbreviation. So one of the things that I might want to do with a table like this is filter it. So maybe I want to get just the counties in a particular state. Now, I can do that pretty easily inside the query editor here. I can say, well, let's filter here and say, perhaps let's just get all of the counties in Arizona. Don't laugh if I get my states wrong, but here we go. We've now got all of the counties inside Arizona. Now, that was pretty easy, but like I said, if I wanted to change that filter here, I'm going to have to go in here, find the filtered rows step, click on that, and then maybe enter a new value here. And like I said, if I was filtering multiple queries by the same state, it would be a little bit difficult to go rooting around to find out where all of those references are. So what I can do is I can say, let's create a new parameter. Let's call this state2 filter and give it a description. I can say this is required. I'm going to have to always enter this because I always want to filter by a particular state. I'm going to have to say what data type this parameter is going to return. And you can see that I've got all of the primitive data types here. This is going to be text because the 2-letter state code is always going to be text. And I've got a couple of options here that we'll come back to, but at the moment I'm just going to say you can enter any bit of text here. And let's put in WA, click OK. So I've got a parameter that just returns the text, WA for Washington. And so here now, if I delete that filter, if I decide that I want to filter by state here, and I go to text filters equals, you'll see that I could still enter a hard-coded value here, but I've got a drop-down. And I can say, let's filter by a parameter. I've only got one parameter. It's called state to filter. Click OK. And now I've got all of the counties in Washington. And if I ever want to change that filter to something like this, it updates automatically. So you can see, at least at this basic level, it's quite a useful thing to have these kind of hard-coded values that we might want to be able to update easily. At this point, in order to keep everybody interested and awake, I'm obliged to do a kind of nice visual demo. Visual is not really my strong point, but let's say now we've got our list of counties. Let's take county state here. Let's put this on a filled map. There's New York State. We've got a kind of unique identifier for each county. I'm just going to drop that onto the legend. Let's turn that legend off. But here we go. We've now got an attractive patchwork data visualization showing all of the different counties in New York superimposed on a map. And I can change the parameter here from outside the query editor. If I go to Edit Queries, Edit Parameters here, I could say, let's do this, change to California. Now, changing that filter means the data needs to be reloaded. The query that loads the data has that filter in it based on the parameter. Changing the parameter means that the engine knows it has to reload the data. It's going to go back to the Excel workbook, reload that data. So I have to click Apply Changes. This is a small amount of data, so it happens quickly. It's worth understanding that there are implications for doing this. This is not like a slicer in your report where changes will happen more or less immediately. This is something that is going to, when you change the parameter, at least in this case, it's going to force the data to be reloaded. But you can see here now we're looking at all of the counties inside California. Let's go back to the query editor. So to recap, when we're configuring a parameter, we've got to give it a name. That's what it's going to be referred to inside the UI. We give it a description. Is it required or not? We have a data type. And we've got some options that say, well, OK, what are we allowed to pick? Now, so far, the parameter that I've created was just any value. You can type in any text. And because I've got a basic knowledge of geography, I was able to type in some 2-letter codes. And I was lucky they were the 2-letter codes for US states. But do I trust my users to be able to do that? Well, probably not. So I need to be able to give them some options. So this is what some of these other options for suggested values give you. So let me go back to Power BI Desktop here, click on Manage Parameters. If I look at suggested values here, I've got 2 other options that I can use. First of all, I can supply a list of values. And in that situation, I effectively get a little grid control here with 1 column and multiple rows. And I can type in some state codes here. I'll just type in 3. I'm going to say that Washington should be the default. Washington will be the current value. Click OK. And you will see, now, instead of just being able to type in what I want, I've got a drop down where I can choose anything from that hard-coded list that I created. And if we go to Edit Parameters here, we'll go back to New York. Still have to reload the data. And there we are, we're back in New York. So we've made this a little bit dynamic. But who wants to type in a great big long list of state codes into a dialog box? We want to make this data-driven, don't we? So this is what the third option is there for. Go to Edit Queries. First of all, I need a query that's going to give me a list of all of the valid codes that I would want to filter by. And as luck would have it, that's in my Excel file as well. So I'm going to go back to, actually, let's go back to Recent Sources. Click on State Codes here. And here's a table taken from that Excel file with all of the valid 2-letter codes in. This is not enough, though. There is something special that I'm going to have to do to this query to allow me to use it to drive a parameter. So this is a table. But when I specify a list of values that are allowed values for a parameter, I have to give the Manage Parameters box a list. A list is a special data type in Power BI. It's like an array or a list of values. It's very similar to a table, but it's not quite the same thing. What we've got here is a table. And with a table with 1 column in it, I can go to Transform. And there is this Convert to List button. This is the button that I need to be able to click, Convert to List. I know it doesn't look very different, but now I've got a list of values. You can see also that the icon has changed here. I've got a query that returns a list. Compare it to the query for counties here that returns a table. And now I can go to State to Filter, Manage Parameter, and I can use the query option here. And I can reference that query containing state codes that I've just set up. Click OK. Let's close and apply. And now if I go to Edit Parameters, there we are. Let's have a look at Indiana. And there are all our counties in Indiana. So now we've got something that I think is a lot more user-friendly. a data-driven list that the end user or the person building the report can select. And we've got a little bit more control over what people select. There are fewer chances of people choosing the wrong thing. So that's the basics of parameters. And we can use parameters in the query editor UI. We can use parameters in the front end in Power BI Desktop. It is really just a developer feature, though. But in the world of Power BI, there's a kind of blurred line between developers, power users who might want to develop reports. And this is something we'll kind of go on to in a bit more. We can create parameters, like I said, manually using the new parameter option and then use them in our queries. We've also got the option to create parameters whenever we're actually doing something in the query editor. So there is another way of building a parameter apart from creating the parameter and then using it. So like I said, another common use for parameters is to say, well, here we've got a data source like an Excel workbook. That's something that might want to change. And when that changes, I want to be able to enter a new value for it easily. So if we go back to edit this, this is the first step, the source step of my query. And this is the path for my Excel workbook, something that I want to be able to abstract away into a parameter. You can see here now I've got this drop-down box, and I can say, well, let's create a new parameter here. Let's call this source file. That will be text. It'll be any value, but there we go, there's my Excel file. So I can actually build a new parameter inside the dialog here. Anytime I can use a parameter, I can create a new parameter. This is going to make absolutely no difference at all to the way my query works. But at least here now, if I change the source, I can do so easily from here, from this parameter. By default, you might not have that option to use parameters. There is a special box you have to check up here on the View tab, Always Allow. If you have this box checked, then you will always have the option to create a new parameter in any one of these filter dialogues. Anywhere that you might want to use a parameter, you'll have the option to be able to do so if you've got that Always Allow option there. If you don't have that checked, if you don't have any parameters already created, you won't see the option to create a new parameter without that. So, parameters are fairly useful things. For a developer, that's great. But like I said earlier, there is a kind of blurred line sometimes in the world of Power BI between hardcore developers and people who are, analysts, power users, people that you want to be able to give the power to build reports for, but maybe they're not quite so experienced as us clever people who go to the Microsoft Data Insights Summit. And this is where templates come in. I've got a Power BI file here with some parameters in. We've seen how you can change the parameters. When you've got a Power BI file that has parameters in, you can save that file not just as a PBIX file, but as a template file. It's a separate file type called a PBIT file. And a template is like your Power BI file, but without the parameters set and with no data loaded in to the data model. Let's see how you can create a parameter file. So here's my PBX file. Let's save this. Let's call it counties demo. And if we have a look here, there's counties demo. And it's 52K. Not an awful lot of data in there. But I can also, when I go to save as a Power BI template file. I've also got the option to do this in a different way by going to export template. Here I've got the opportunity to enter a description. We won't do that. But here, let's call this counties template. And now I've saved this as a template file. So where's that gone? Here you can see, compared to my first demo file, which was 52K, this is only 12K. This is a copy of that Power BI file, but without the data in, and without the template, without any of these parameters set. And the key thing about this is, if I close this file and I open up the template, when I open up the template, the first thing that's going to happen is that I'm going to be prompted to set the parameters. So here, I can choose that. Oh, I forgot to set the default value in here, but let's do this. Click load, and as soon as I've set those parameters, the data gets loaded in. I use templates quite a lot because there are going to be a lot of situations where people want to be able to build their reports, but they don't want to be able to build them from scratch. They want somebody to build a kind of shell report with, report with visuals in them, with a data model, with some queries to load the data, but they want to be able to customize that easily. They want to be able to do it without having to write code, but they want that customization. For example, let's imagine that you've got a lot of people that want to be able to build reports based on a particular customer ID. You might have a gigantic sales table with sales by customer, and you want people to be able to type in a customer ID, and that report will then be customized just for that particular customer. You can use a template to do that. You can build a template report that will work for any customer. The end user opens the template file. They get prompted to enter a customer ID. They enter it. The data for that customer ID is loaded in. And then they've not only got a working file with data already filtered for that customer loaded in, but they can go away and customize it. They've got something that they can work with and change. It's a great starting point for building their own reports. And this is where I really like parameters. It means that people who wouldn't want to build a report from scratch are able to do so and have something that they can then build on top of. Finally, the other cool thing that we've got with templates is the ability to build functions. Now, functions is a bit of something that's in the M language underneath the query editor. People who've been writing M and doing cool stuff in the query editor have been using functions for a long, long time, but traditionally it was something that you could only do if you wrote code. So there was a big barrier to entry. But functions themselves now can be built without writing any code at all by starting off with queries that contain parameters. So now you're going to get the power of functions without having to write any code. So what on earth is a function? What am I going to be using it for? Well, anybody that's done any programming will know that a function is like a kind of encapsulated bit of logic that you can pass some values in. It does the same sort of stuff, and it spits something out. And we can create functions now from queries that contain parameters. So I'm going to move on to a slightly different data set now. What I've got here is some data that I found when I was Googling for something that's kind of relevant to the US. And what we've got here is, I guess, some government open data where, among other things, I can enter a county and I can get a list of cities and their locations from that county. So if we scroll down here, we've got, for example, all data for a specific county. Let's copy this URL here. And when I have a look at this URL here, what this is doing is saying, get all of the data from the Small Business Administration for Orange County in California, and it comes back as an XML file. And in this XML file, we've got a list of cities, and among other things, we've got latitudes and longitudes for those cities. So, you know, with my county data, this might be a kind of useful thing to have along with it. So let's take this and let's go to the query editor. And let's build a new query. I'm going to use the From Web option here. Click Connect. Enter the URL. Click OK. Let's call this Cities Demo. At the moment, it's just a bit of XML. We need to drill down in here to find something useful, so let's click to drill down here. And already here we can see a list of cities in Orange County with their latitude and longitude. So we've got a URL we can call, which will give me a list of cities for a particular county. Now, at the moment, that URL is hard-coded. But, of course, we can say, well, let's take that and replace it with a new parameter. Let's call this source URL. It's going to be text. And there is the source URL again. And, you know, it's made absolutely no difference, except that the starting point is now a parameter rather than a hard-coded bit of text. But the cool thing is, now that I've got a query that contains a parameter, I can right-click on the query, and I've got this option here to create a function. So let's click that option and see what it does. Let's call this Get Cities. And you'll see actually a whole load of different things have happened here. I've still got my cities demo query. That works in exactly the same way as before. I've now got bundled in with it the source URL parameter. And now I've got something interesting here, which is my getCities function. Basically, this getCities function is going to allow me to enter a URL that would be a valid URL for that particular website that I've just shown you, and run that query, but not for Orange County, but for any other valid URL that I've got. So I've got some other valid URLs here. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, so let's use King County in Washington. I can paste the URL for King County, Washington into the source for this particular function. I'm going to invoke my getCities function, and now I've got a new query here, automatically generated, that gives me all of these cities in King County, Washington. So with a function, I can say, well, let's encapsulate all of that logic to go to the website, get that XML file, get a table back, but now I can call it for any URL that I've got. Let's delete this. The interesting thing here is that now my original cities demo query and my function are kind of magically linked together. And any changes that I make to this query here, my kind of sample query, will automatically update the logic of the function. So if I look at the code here, you can see that I get a warning not to edit it, otherwise that magic will stop. But there's a lot of stuff happening here. I'm connecting to the file, to the website, getting the data, drilling down. If I actually delete all of these steps and just go back to the beginning, you will see that the code here has changed as well. So it's still dynamic even after I've clicked that create function button. I've got a query and a function magically linked together. So what can I do with this? Well, here under counties, let's reference this query, and let's call this cities. Now, in cities, in my counties query, remember I've got a list of counties in my state. and I've got the state code, and I've got the name of the county. So county or equivalent here. And as luck would have it, these are the building blocks that I can use to build a URL to feed into that function that I've just created. And already prepared here, I've got the required expression. So I'm going to add a new custom column here. And all I'm doing now is for each row in this table, which is a list of counties, building the URL that would allow me to call that particular website and get the cities inside each of these counties. So click OK. Now I could have built this up with the UI. I've just taken a shortcut. But let's make that text. Let's make it all lowercase as well. And now I've got this table with one row in for each county, the URL that I can pass to that function, and the magic thing is now I can click the invoke custom function button here. This is going to allow me to create a new column on my table, and for each row in that table I can call that function that I've just built, and for each county get the list of cities in that county. So let's click the invoke custom function button. It doesn't matter what the column's called. We've got a get cities function here. We're going to pass the value from that custom column that we built here into the parameter on each call. Click OK. This may take a little bit of time because we are making lots and lots of calls to that website. But now you can see that having done that, I've called that function once for every row in the table. And I've got a column now with nested table values in. And I can expand this. Let's get this value. I want to be able to drill down again. And let's get just the names, the primary latitudes and longitudes. And having expanded that, now instead of having one row for each county, I've now got one row for each city in each county. There are some missing counties. For some reason, this website doesn't have full data for every single county, but you can see here that I've got a list of cities in each county. Let's make that text. Let's make that a decimal number. Let's make that a decimal number. We don't want to load this in, but we want to load everything else in. So we'll click close and apply. Again, we have to wait a little bit of time, but I can now build a new report on here. Get my cities. Let's get the list of names, latitudes and longitudes. Let's plot this on a map. And there are all of my cities plotted on the map for Alaska. And of course here we can go to edit parameters. Let's change this, for example, to, let's keep it topical and go to Washington. Click OK, apply changes. We're going to go away and we're going to reload the table filtered for Washington, and then once we've loaded that table, we're going to be able to call our function for every single county in Washington, and there we've got all of the cities in Washington plotted on a map. And functions, I think, are a really, really powerful feature. Who's used the combine files button to get all of the data from text files or all of the data from Excel files? You might have noticed that that's changed in the last 6 months or so. And when you do that, suddenly all of these extra things appear, parameters and functions. You might think, oh, what on earth's that? All that's doing is exactly what I've done manually here. It's created a query based on your sample file. It's built a function tied to that query. It's got some parameters in there. Basically, it's kind of automatically done exactly what I've just done manually there. So hopefully that kind of explains what that new bit of functionality is doing. That's my official 40 minutes wrapped up. We've got 10 minutes for questions. So who's got a question? If you've got a question, could you come up to the microphone, please?
So this is all in the desktop version, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do the parameters and the functions then translate to the web version for end users, for dashboard users?
That is a good question. It was something on my slides, something I forgot to mention. Maybe I'm kind of automatically filtering out the bad news. The bad news is that once you've published your report, you cannot change the parameters. I would really, really, really like it if you could do that once you've published the report. It wouldn't even need to be something interactive that the end users could change. I mean, it would be great if you could, but really, given that an end user can click that refresh data button inside in the browser in Power BI, it would be ideal if when they did that, they had the option to change parameters as well. There is actually, interestingly, a hidden feature that I did have a slide about, but I believe it might be going away, so I didn't want to talk about it. You've got the option to create, when you create a content pack, you can create something called a template content pack. And if you've got a published data set that contains parameters, and if you turn that into a content pack, there's actually a kind of hidden button that allows to say, make this a template content pack. And then when you connect to the content pack, you actually get the opportunity to change the parameter in there. So actually there is a kind of bit of functionality that allows you to change the parameter, but there are a lot of limitations on it. You can only have text parameters, you can only enter values, you can't have more than one data source, lots and lots of things, and I believe it's something that's kind of being de-emphasized, so I don't want to show it. Next question.
Two questions. One, you showed the county and the cities earlier. Mm-hmm. It was all plotted out, not dots. I know this has a Latin long information, but how do you show it where it's plotted out, like all the counties, different colors?
How do I
all the
show
cities within the county, different colors?
All I'm doing is just using the name as the legend. So if you put, for example, here, I've got the name in the legend. Once you've got the name in the legend, that just colors everything differently anyway. So that just happens just by populating that legend field.
Not the circle I was referring to, how the whole city is painted in different color. Is it a different map, a different control, or?
Oh yeah, sorry. So this is a different visual here. So this is the map visual here. What I'm doing is I'm using the filled map visual here. It's the difference between this is the filled map, this is the map.
Okay, thank you. How about embedded report parameters? Can you shed some light on that?
How do you mean?
Passing a parameter to an embedded report?
Using Power BI Embedded. I don't believe you can do that at all with Power BI Embedded. Certainly at the moment, there is no way that after you've published a report, you can change parameters. Okay. Next question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can you layer parameters? So in your example, you had the states. Could you then, once you've selected the state, can it pop a second question saying, can you select county?
Oh, excellent question. Cascading parameters like you could have in reporting services? Not really, no. I've tried it. It kind of works sometimes, but not always. It doesn't know enough to be able to say, if this parameter's changed, I've then got to refresh this other parameter. So it kind of works, but not enough for you to want to be able to count on it, unfortunately.
So your end report builder would have to use a slicer or something in the actual report they build?
Yes, really. I mean, for something like that, a slicer is much better anyway.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so in parameter, like if you are using SAP HANA as a data source, you can define parameters in the HANA side. Can we use that information, parameter information, and will it allow us to filter the data based on parameter design within the database?
So what do you mean by the data view? So what I'm doing here is I'm using parameters to filter the data that gets loaded into the Power BI data model.
Yes.
So this is filtering that happens at refresh time rather than at kind of data visualization time. That's why every time I changed a parameter, a little yellow box came up that said I've got to apply these changes, and the data was actually reloaded into the data model.
No, but in SAP HANA, you have a functionality where you can define parameters, and when you try to connect to HANA using connector, it gives you at the query level, when you initially connect to HANA, it gives you those parameters. But if I want to use that information after loading, after bringing, it doesn't allow. So I don't know whether...
do you want to be able to, for example, display the selected parameter?
Yeah.
Well, these are just queries. By default, they're not loaded into the data model, but you can turn that on, and then you can have a table containing that value and display it very easily. So for example here, so assuming that I know what you're asking, here's my state to filter parameter. You'll notice that it's got its enable load button unchecked by default, but I can check it, and when I do that, I've now got a state to filter box here, and I could actually just drag that onto there, and let's just make that a table. So yeah, I can get at that selected parameter value.
Okay,
is that
so
what you were asking?
Yeah, I was asking, like, even before importing, if it is parameter can be passed to the query, if something like that is available. So, you know...
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, but let's take this offline. We can have a chat properly afterwards.
For non-menu driven parameter filtering, it's best to go through the UI. Like if you want to pass it to a SQL query, just go to the advanced editor and put it in that way. In your get data, you have a SQL query and you just want to pass an ID to it. Just go through the advanced editor. Or is there a best practice for doing it when there's not a menu option for it?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So you're thinking about...
So if I do get data and I write a SQL query and it's got ID, where ID equals whatever, but there's not a menu option for it, it's just best to go through the advanced editor and just put in the parameter name inside of there.
I mean, in that situation, if you're passing a parameter into a kind of dynamically generated query, you're going to be forced to write some code. There's no way of doing that inside the UI. It would be really nice if the UI allowed you to say, well, let's connect, for example, to a stored procedure, and then, you know, here are some inputs to the stored procedure, here are some parameters that I've got inside my query, let's match them all up. Maybe that will happen one day, but it's not available at the moment. You've got to write the code to be able to do that.
Cool.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for the very nice demo. I had a question about the keynote this morning, the what if box. Looks like that's also a parameter-ish type of feature. You know anything about the relationship between
I don't work for Microsoft. That was the first time I'd even seen that. So I overheard a conversation that indicated how it might work, but I'm not at liberty to repeat that. That's just hearsay. So I don't think it's quite the same as this.
Okay, thank you.
On your parameter setup, by the way, yeah, very good demonstration. I like it. On your parameter demonstration, is there a way, once you import that list from that drop-down menu, to select either like an alphabetical selection process or most recent value published? Or
it would be absolutely possible to sort that list.
Okay.
That would be something you'd have to do in the query that was driving that that list. So, for example, here at the moment, here's my list of state codes. I could absolutely go in here and say, let's sort it, I don't know, in descending order. And there I've got it in descending order. And now, if we do this, what we should see, it'll take a bit of time to refresh, but you'll see that the order should be respected in the UI. So you can sort it like that. I don't think there is any way to say, you know, what's the most recent one, for example.
But in the parameter itself, there's no option to describe the sorting rule?
No, there isn't at all.
Okay.
That's going to be purely determined by the query that you're using to drive the parameter values.
All right. Still very good.
So one follow-up question, and it may be beyond the scope of this, but with Power BI and SSRS 2016 now becoming integrated, do you have any thoughts on how the parameter functions would work between the two? We use SSRS a lot in my company with parameters, obviously. So
There is no official integration between Power BI and Reporting Services 2017. What's happened is that we've got, there's no crossover between that. We've got Power BI Report Server, which is a kind of superset of reporting services, and that's where all the Power BI integration is going. One thing, this Power Query technology is springing up all over the place. It's in Power BI, it's in Excel, it's now in analysis services. One thing I've always wanted to see is to see it inside just normal, regular reporting services, because I think this would be massively useful for people just doing regular old reporting services work. And if they were to do that, they would need to develop parameters a bit more to make, I would want to see parameters have all of the things that we've got in reporting services parameters today. Okay. They're very, very basic compared to what you can do with reporting services parameters.
It's not as you know, or it's not as you know for now at this time in the Power BI reporting platform.
No.
Okay.
Nothing like that. That's a long way away if they're even thinking about it.
All right. Is there any way to pass environment variables to parameters?
No.
Okay. Is there any way you can think of that you could basically take the logged on users' information and...
You would be able to hack it using an R expression if you knew how to write it in R, but I think that would be the only way, unless you've got some other mechanism for getting that data into the Power BI data model. Yes, you've got an idea?
PowerShell?
But that's going to have to put that somewhere that Power BI can get it. Yeah. I mean, I've seen people do clever stuff with R, where you can get all kinds of things in R that you can't get in M and normal stuff. That would probably be the only way, but frankly, that's a bit of a hack.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Just a quick one on this list specifically. So you said when you save it as a template, none of the data is stored.
Yep.
But yet that list is driven from a sheet.
Yes.
So
well, when I opened when I opened the template, that query that got all the list of state codes was refreshed.
So the template would still be dependent upon the list that drives the parameter.
Exactly. Okay. And storing that in an Excel worksheet would be crazy. You'd want to get it in some kind of central data source that everybody could access.
Fair enough.
All right. That's probably my time up. So thank you for listening.
I have one question.
And come to my session tomorrow about web services if you want to learn more about this kind of stuff.